for thing. I just remembered that I forgot to do that. And my mother is joining. I recently came out to her, and yeah, she's joining as a guest to learn a little bit more. Okay. Yeah, so I guess we could get started with sort of what are some general like best practices you suggest when building relationships with sort of not even just trans communities, but maybe just marginalized communities in general, since that's what you guys work on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start things off here. And I would say really end of the day, it's about including the voices of the people that you're representing. Um, I think as somebody who works a lot in the environmental justice space and with in a lot of communities where I personally often don't have a personal relationship to, or like the last thing you want is to talk for somebody without understanding their story. And so if it comes to transgender community members, just anyone else, whether you share an identity or not, you have somebody consult on the campaign who's a member of that community. And ideally, you're bringing a broad spectrum of voices into the room as much as you can. But at the end of the day, are you creating that space for somebody to honestly share their opinion? And are you listening to that opinion?
Yeah, thanks, Byron. I agree. Definitely start with, listening and asking questions. People are the experts of their own lives. And so, I think some of the things that we do at Berkeley Media Studies Group is, we look at the news and we're looking at whether or not we see people with lived experience who are being quoted as sources. And, we realize that for a lot of marginalized communities, whether it's by race, class, or gender, that if we're going to be using the media to advocate for certain issues, we need to hear from the people who are most impacted by those. So, one of our things that we do is we train people, and we want to make sure that people are adequately compensated to be able to tell their stories too, right? We want these interactions to be not only transactional, but transformational and reciprocal. So I think it's really important that when we're working with any community that, we listen, ask questions. Everyone is the expert of their own lives, and when we're making an interaction happen, that it's not just transactional, but transformational as well, so that and also that people are fairly compensated, because we love to see people compensated for their expertise. So.
And how would you sort of define making something transformational then?
Yeah, I think we definitely want to view, um, every interaction, whether it's like an interview or a focus group, that it's not just extracting information one way, that you also are able to provide resources, whether it's materially like compensation, or to be able to connect people with the resources that you are making and have it more of a collaborative, two-way street, I guess, is what I would say, is thinking about it not just one way. I think in research, from my background, sometimes it's like we have to be really objective. We can't bring ourselves into the picture, but the reality is we're all still humans. We have to view each other with dignity and compassion. And so I think that, bringing ourselves into the picture and showing our blind spots, and also recognizing the expertise in other people, and honoring that. So.
Mhm. Um, so I guess, when I sent you guys the email, the general sort of thing was being inclusive in sort of media, and also like, what are your tips, I guess, on create or like inclusivity, just as sort of a general overview, for anyone who may not be too familiar with maybe some more of like the newer sort of nuanced things that have come up as gender has sort of become more of a topic in the world, I guess.
Um, yeah. So I guess the question was how to be more inclusive in the media. Any tips? So I guess, really be intentional about diversifying your sources and the people that you're talking to, connecting to community-based groups, um, who can connect you maybe with people who um, are directly, living as trans or as non-binary um, or, as a person of color. So I think it's for us, we're really interested in seeing the media landscape change. We want to see more people represented as sources in these stories because ultimately we know that these news stories shape public discourse, they shape public policy. And so when we see that, these policies are being enacted against our trans communities, um, it's it's more likely that there are less trans voices actually visible in the news to help actually inform the public discourse. So I think for any reporters, if you have connections or relations, or you see stories go up where they're missing people's voices who are actually directly impacted by these issues, it's an opportunity to send a letter, to send an email to the reporter or the editor and let them know that there are other sources that need to be heard in the news because it can't just be top down. But also we want to hear from people who are most directly impacted by these issues. So, yeah.
Oh. And thank you, Kim, because I'll add a bit onto that as well. So of course, touched upon it earlier, where you're writing a story or doing any type of work where you are hoping to represent trans voices, ideally you have that voice in the room. But I think there's certainly a large element, and I think a huge part of why representation is what it is we see so few trans people telling that story. Like whether that's a spokesperson or whether that's a reporter or whether that is somebody who's the primary source, policymaker, what have you not. And so I think part of it, there's also kind of a roundabout way where you're starting from building more representation in the field, providing that mentorship, providing those opportunities to, for one, as PR practitioners, pitching journalists who are trans or getting feedback and building those relationships and helping folks along with sharing clips with your network and putting in good names for your colleagues as they move on throughout the field, whether they stay in PR or stay in journalism or respectively, whatnot, and providing more opportunities for these stories to be told from these perspectives.
I just wanted to, yeah.
So, hello, I'm Allison Galden. I'm faculty advisor for the PRSSA chapter and the faculty at the Reynolds School of Journalism. There's a fine balance in terms of identifying trans and non-binary person. And I think similar to communities of color where you don't want to be the person who goes to the one trans person to tell me the story. Like, how do you build kind of that network of people in the community? Or what are there national resources that we could, or each of your individual groups that we could access to say, hey, we're trying to have that voice in the room, but unless we know Jesse here, we may not know somebody who belongs in that community.
Yeah, no, and I 100% hear you. And I'll say as well, as somebody who's often the one trans voice in the room when it comes to a lot of PR functions or a lot of events. No, I hear you. It's like finding those voices is a challenge at times. But I will say, the one place that comes to mind is an organization called the Trans Journalists Association. And I can share some of the resources in chat, but along with hosting a style guide, featuring and different resources for both communicators and for journalists, you're reporting on trans issues. It's also like a space of networking and connection for journalists and communicators who identify as trans or non-binary. And so wonderful organization if you're looking for a voice to add to the conversation. And I would say engaging with some of the larger LGBTQ organizing groups, such as PFLAG, GLAD, and even the ACLU, like they'll typically have state groups or resources they can connect you to and get you at least started on building those connections.
Terrific, thank you.
Yeah, I want to second Trans Journalists Association. Kay, I believe connected me with Jesse, and I
Yeah,
connected with TJA just by I had read an article about their work, and so I sent an email. You know, I think it was definitely like a cold email. We had no personal connection whatsoever, but Kay was really generous with the time and sharing space, to be able to build a connection. And I think you really have to start out with your clear intention. I think as if you have a clear intention as to what your connection is for, why you want to build this connection with this person, and you're, clear about that. Hopefully, if anything, yeah, ask good questions, be curious, be humble, and hopefully, if not that one person, maybe they know someone else who does. But your local LGBTQ center. Also, I want to shout out Translash Media. They're doing amazing work in this space as well. So in addition to Trans Journalists Association, I would also check out Translash Media or Assigned Media, which shows a lot of news about anti-trans legislation, but I think provides some great resources there as well.
Terrific, those are great. Jesse, are you putting those in the chat?
oh, there is a couple of chat messages. I can send these. I think Vicky is currently taking notes for this so that we could have sort of a handout. I have sent the style guide to the faculty at the RSJ. I was like, this is so cool that they're coming out with this, because we get like one entry in the AP style guide, and yeah, it's pretty extensive, but to have one large one that encompasses issues that maybe people who create the AP style guide may not be familiar with, it was great. And I do have to agree that the Trans Journalists Association has been fantastic. We wouldn't have these wonderful speakers here with us today. Kay has been like incredibly helpful. It makes me upset or it makes me sad, I should say, that they are not going to be able to be here today, mainly because like they mentioned health issues. So that's totally fine. But yeah, I am so glad that they introduced me to you too. Yeah, do you guys have any questions in the room besides Allison so far?
I have one other.
Mhm.
I too have been an ally in this community for a long time, so mostly I'm asking the questions for those who may not have been in the community a long time. But what can those of us who are allies do to further find the voices, share the voices, expand the voices of those in this community? What can we do?
I'm happy to chime in, and I think one way to, as for an ally to show up is to share stories of trans joy. I think we hear a lot about the attacks on our trans communities. Um, and I think there are also lots of amazing stories of trans history and, all the incredible activism that has happened over the years that have paved the way for, LGBTQ people to exist and to not only like survive, but thrive out here. Um, and I think, if you do see, instances of transphobia or people who are, yeah, if you do come across instances of transphobia, as an ally, be an active ally. I think it's easy to be a bystander in these situations, and speak up. If someone is being attacked, check if they're okay. If someone is being silenced, check if they're okay, and also point out that there are other voices that need to be heard in the room, really important voices. So I think there's like a lot of space for, people to step into more of that allyship, ensuring the safety of trans and non-binary folks in the rooms that they're in, um, and sharing more about trans joy. So.
I love that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I'll just add on really quickly here. I think a powerful thing you can do as an ally is you effectively open the door to those of us who aren't in positions of power. And so whether that is, whether as Kim mentioned, you're sharing resources and you're checking in, you have the space to also say to folks who are maybe allies, who aren't part of the trans community, answer the questions that folks have about the community, that as opposed to just having people in the trans community answer them. Like the 101 questions that we get all the time, that are pretty frustrating to answer and come up constantly. And an element of also, you have trans voices that you listen to, share resources with your network, and hey, put a good name for somebody on the resume or as a reference. Get people in the room.
Love it.
Okay, I guess I have one question as like someone who is trans and is generally the person in the room people ask. I always do preface things with, I am just one person though. Is there any way sort of like, besides saying I'm just a single person, to like, I don't know how to explain it. I've just found it very difficult sometimes to speak when people ask me about the trans community, because I'm like, oh wow, this is a very diverse place. I don't even know where to like what my sort of boundaries are, or even if there are boundaries for what I could speak on. Like it's very difficult, but if you guys could impart some knowledge, I guess, from your perspective on being the voice in the room, I would really appreciate that.
Absolutely. I'll take this on real quick. And then Kim, if you want to add anything, feel free. But 100% is a position that I 100% feel, Jesse, here you there, have been that voice many, 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 many times. And I would say, I think you actually touched upon it in your question. Because I think a lot of it is admitting that there are issues you can't speak on behalf of. You can only really speak on behalf of your own perspective and who you are and your own history. And I think it's having that humility to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. I appreciate that you recognize that, or that you're giving me space, but I'm not the best person to answer everything here. And I think this is an opportunity where you can step back and refer people to other resources if you know of any or have any in mind. Answer what you can, but acknowledge and don't feel like you have to answer everything or be the spokesperson for the trans community, which I feel is a position that a lot of us get into as communicators if we're part of a underrepresented community.
Oh yeah.
Like we're the spokesperson, not just for our organizations and our causes, but we effectively have to be the PR for our identity. And I think it's recognizing, and that can take a lot out of you. I'll just preface with. And I think part of the challenge is you recognizing when it's okay for you to step back and step out of that spokesperson role that it is so easy to fall into.
Mm-hmm. I guess another sort of follow-up question to that would be, if there's ever a moment where like you notice someone, like say that maybe you're not the only person who's part of this conversation, perhaps it's online, and you notice somebody who may be overstepping their boundaries and acting sort of as a spokesperson or acting as if they are the spokesperson for a certain community or group, how is sort of a respectful way to sort of just like say, hey, that's just your perspective though, because I always think it's a little bit dangerous when people start doing that, because then who knows what kind of bigoted person could come up and be like, see, they said that and they're the spokesperson. It's like, well, they just said that they were, but like, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and which wonderful question, by the way. And gosh, and that is something I see all the time when it comes to questions and conversations around, say, access to medical care. Or and it's certainly a dynamic I see a lot of time in the trans community as a whole. And I think those are moments where I think on one hand, there is, unfortunately, at times, sometimes it is the loudest voice in the room that gets most eyes, gets most traction. But I think it's you being open, being the dissenting voice. It is offering those resources, because you're not going to win everybody. And there are certainly people who are going to follow the loudest, most obnoxious voice in the room. But that dissent's out there. That comment or that raised hand. And as long as that's in the picture and part of the record, then that's part of challenging that narrative that someone else is setting that for whatever reason is, whatever their motive is, you challenging that dominant narrative that's contrary to really the rest of the community's wishes.
Yeah, that's super real, I think. Yeah, thank you, Byron, for sharing. I think like the experience of being like the token that sucks, but then also seeing people speaking on behalf of the community that maybe isn't representative of your community. We see that all the time. I think like these talking heads for, like I think it was the Proud Boys. It was like a Latino man who was like the head of that, and he doesn't represent all Latinos. Similarly, I think there are folks who are spokespeople or talking heads for anti-trans movements who claim to, I tried to transition and I didn't. And yeah, these are voices. They have their truths, and sometimes we do have to kind of step forward and say, that's their truth, but here's the reality. Here's the landscape against which this is happening, which is, and you can use stats, data, show that, okay, my experience sure is one thing. And also here is a pattern happening in our systems that trans folks are, being denied healthcare, being denied, basic rights, being denied access to bathrooms, so I think like by pointing out the systems and the landscape in which these things are happening and these larger patterns, you kind of you can add in your personal story, but also point out that these are bigger patterns that are happening to the wider communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for like your insight on those things. I'm not gonna lie, it does stress me out sometimes, because I'm like, oh wow, I am like, I know that I'm few in number. It's just like, or we're very spread out, to say the least. It's just been great to know that I'm not the only person who goes through stuff like that, and to also have people sort of be aware that that is sort of the case for people who they might know as like the guy for this, or the person to go for. I guess one of the other questions that I have on this list, I think, Kim, you might know quite a bit about this. I'm also Filipino. My mom is also Filipino. She is here today. But yeah, I just wanted to ask sort of like, how can one be sort of trans inclusive in cross-cultural communications?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think everyone walks in with lots of different lives behind them. You know, you're not just one single thing. You can be trans and Asian, you know, you can be trans and poor, like trans and you know, like all these other identities that we can hold. So, you know, I think when we're thinking about trans issues and cross-cultural issues, really just starts with the person and the story that they want to tell, and how the systems and structures that we live in, how those have shaped people's lives, because of these identities. So, but yeah, with the Filipino communities, for example, there's like still very strong gender norms. So we have to also like meet people where they are. We know that not everyone's going to understand trans or non-binary or gender queer right away. And you know, I think one thing we talk about is really using plain language as much as possible in your communication. So, you know, don't get caught up in the jargon. There's always going to be a new term to refer to something, but what is really the heart of what you're talking about? What are the values that you're trying to espouse? So, you know, everyone deserves dignity, respect, compassion, and leading with those, and then, you know, thinking about how to translate some of these concepts to people who may be less familiar, which is totally valid. You know, we all had to start somewhere. Certainly, my journey towards, you know, being out as non-binary is not, you know, it wasn't linear by any means, and certainly still learning and exploring this identity. So I think, yeah, everyone has like their own personal journey. So, um, really elevating that and trying to translate that into plain language as much as possible, meeting people where they are. I don't know, Byron, if you have anything to add there. Yeah.
You know, not much to add. I mean, just beautiful. And you know, you mentioned something very beautiful early on, which I think the phrase you used was, you know, everyone walks different lives behind them. And I think that, like, no matter who your audience is, I mean, I think as a communicator, there's something you carry forward. It's the fact that, yeah, I think it's giving the public, giving your audience, giving your various audiences, whoever they are, you know, that dignity and respect that you likewise, you know, hold for yourself. And but I think Kim, of course, like I said, not much, of course, to add from this end, other than just come in with humility and willingness to learn and what have you not.
And also, I would like to let anybody know who's in the Zoom meeting, you could send questions in chat if you would like. Want to ask anyone in the room if they have any questions, sort of, as things come up. Yeah, Jada.
I was kind of wondering about a topic that we've talked about in the beginning, which was trans inclusivity within the media. And like, if you're reading about it and you don't really know how to understand the credibility, like if you're reading an article, does it go back to just, you know, checking the sources and seeing if there was a trans person involved in the writing of the article? Like, just kind of wondering about how to really understand the credibility when you're reading about this stuff, like, and trying to learn about it.
Yeah, so Jada, so if it has a question, and Kim, I'm sure can add a lot when it comes to understanding the credibility of specific sources. But I would say when you see anything reported, especially in mainstream, news outlets, like let's say your New York Times, your Washington Post, what have you not, you know, the thing you always, I think there's a certain level of skepticism you have to have when you read anything involving trans communities. But I'd say, you know, big flag, of course, is, was anyone trans consulted on this or interviewed? And if you look back at the research that articles are citing, that's a big clue. Like, how many people were, for instance, in any given study, how many people were ultimately part of the study? Where was the study published? Who sponsored it? Because something that a lot of anti-trans organizations and groups and people with very strong, you know, ideological agendas will do, and you can see this in climate reporting as well. You see a lot of these oppositional groups come in with studies and like the same 5 talking heads that get trotted around at different hearings. But if you look back on who's funding these, who's publishing these research papers, you see some similar names come up with ideological bets. So it's being very critical about where primary sources are coming from at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, +1 to all of that. I think, when I think about the credibility of sources, it is hard to tell. You don't know. And, I think even as like a person of color, not all skin folk are kinfolk. So, they are speaking from their lens, but there's like multiple identities that people hold. And so I think like for me, one of the helpful resources that I've seen recently is from the Southern Poverty Law Center, which did a really in-depth investigation into misinformation about trans communities and specifically how they like manufacture doubt through what Byron mentioned, these counter studies, these fake research. We see this done by climate or big oil companies, big beverage, big sugar companies, big soda, they come in with these counter studies, this research that's funded by industry or these big, entities, corporate entities. And people, it takes a lot of work to really understand. I think at face value, you see it, the name of a group. Oh, this group is defending freedom or something for liberty. And you're like, oh, that sounds great. But when you really see where the money where the money is coming from, it's these people with really right-wing agendas. And so you do have to be pretty discerning, do your research. I think any media literacy skills, I'm still learning, especially in the age of AI, like how to spot, what's real or what's fake or misinformation. But certainly, I think the Southern Poverty Law Center does have some really good resources looking at the types of groups that are putting out this research, funding this research, or funding spokespeople, talking heads who are going to speak on behalf of trans communities, but against trans communities. So another resource is Trans Data Library, and they look at actors who are involved in the anti-trans movement. So I think they have actors, organizations, different individuals and groups that are supporting anti-trans movement. So that's another place to maybe check out. If you're like curious about a source that you read about, is if they end up on that list, that might be a red flag. So.
Oh, yes, Chloe.
I have a question kind of along those lines. I feel like when I've read a lot of articles about like trans communities or just like the LGBTQ plus community in general, some have almost like exploiting undertones. And I was just wondering if that's something that you guys have dealt with and how you dealt with it and how you like go about avoiding that. Like
Ooh.
exploit the community rather than highlight them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I believe so. And I definitely feel free to, if I'm not misrepresenting what you're asking, feel free to cut me off. But it is something that we have a couple of my clients, my agency and I actually partnered with Key Flag for a while, and we have partnered with a number of other LGBT organizations in the past. And I would say there is a suspicion that we've had and seen when we have reporters that we don't really know, like wanting to reach out and speak to families of transgender children or individuals who are trans or non-binary. And I would say it's usually pretty easy to tell from the outside if something's off. When it comes to whether or not we suspect that it's an exploitative situation for a family or for somebody who identifies as part of the community, someone who is part of the community. And it's one of those things where I think it's the vibe, where it's, and I don't want to advocate for, say, coming into every conversation with a journalist with a high degree of skepticism, but you're coming in a sense with a degree of skepticism. And I'll take it really from just the preparing clients potentially angle of, how do you support someone? How do you represent somebody and protect them from exploitation? And I think as a communicator, you have a very powerful way to do that by doing your best to brief brief reporters, brief folks asking for information as much as you can. You get all information about the angle they're writing, how they approach the story, and you're researching everything researching all their past articles and how they've tended to talk about what underrepresented communities in general. And then going back to your client or to the folks you're working with, and you do everything you can to prepare them and ensure you have the full consent and they know entirely what they're walking into as much as you can, but being willing to intervene if you feel that interviews or reporting is going into that exploitive direction. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to sit in on every single interview. Although perhaps for a child or for a family, your presence is more welcome versus a more seasoned client who's more media savvy. But it's being willing to use your voice and intervene as much as you can when the vibe starts feeling off.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think for anyone who gets pushed by the media, prioritize your safety, right? I think that is number one. And, I do think it is unfortunate that the media often portrays people with lived experience as like victims or, poor me type stories. And I think, a question you can always ask people with lived experience, trans, person of color, is what would you do, to solve a problem that, you're facing? And frame, people as experts, as agents of change, as leaders in their own communities. Everyone, I think, has the something to share. And so if you prompt people to really ask more about how you would want to see things change, who you think can help advance that change, I think by kind of just reframing a little bit and asking these questions about how people would advance solutions and to the problems they're facing from their lived experience, can help move away from that exploitative framing a little bit.
Questions, or we are at like 6:50, so I did want to ask if you guys had anything to add that I might not have specifically asked, or someone may not have specifically asked, but you think is still important to keep in mind as we go into communications as a career.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll touch just very briefly on this, but depending on whether or not you go into corporate PR or you represent an organization as opposed to maybe more private consulting, the one thing I'm going to stress just again and again is if you have an organization that hopes to be an ally and be supportive, by God, hold them to it. Because I would say like the big misstep that I've been really thinking back and chewing on over the past couple of years here is Budweiser. And so right. Okay. Yeah. Y'all know. Because here's the worst part about what Budweiser did. The worst part. They put Dylan Mulvaney out there and they said nothing when she started getting attacked on all sides. They stepped back. They retreated, and they nary spoke on trans issues again. But the thing, like nobody's happy with Budweiser at that point. Because the thing that your audiences recognize, even if they don't agree with you, is they recognize integrity. Like, are you holding the same position? Are you standing up for your values? And if you're not doing any of that, then what's the point? Because at the end of the day, you as a communicator, you're not just telling the story of a brand or of an organization. You're telling the story of your people, of who we are, and it's all about, how are you using your voice and your talents as a communicator to push change in the right direction. So integrity really, like, stand by your statements.
Yeah, it basically comes down to asking a lot of corporations who get into hot water over these things. It's just have a spine, really, like stand up for trans issues instead of backing out. I know Target just sort of like folded to a bunch of transphobia, and then that was sort of it for them. Like it just came off as very obviously corporate in that situation. And same with Budweiser. It's like, oh, you just saw an opportunity, and now that opportunity doesn't serve you anymore. So now you're not an ally, which isn't how allyship works at all. So yeah, thank you for that. Kim, do you have anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that came to mind was, if you're not already familiar with the Radical Communicators Network, I would highly recommend, checking out. They have a Google group. They send tons of resources, job opportunities, lots of great conversations for different communicators across the spectrum, but mostly working on, justice and liberation for trans communities, communities of color. And so I think it's a great resource for anyone. And I guess I think one thing I would think about is what are your, core values? And I think, like, I have a strong activism background, Filipino uh, worker organizing. And so I think, you know, continue building your community and really identify what you are, working towards, or what's the change you want to see. I think we're in a time, it's an election year. There's tons of legislative attacks. The DEI office at the federal level just got shut down. There's tons of stuff going on. I think if you are really clear on your values and where you stand, and then align yourself with organizations who do that work, and be able to advance, justice and liberation for all, I think you're going to be off to a good start. But yeah, I think if anyone is, like, interested in reaching out or talking more about these issues, I'm always happy to connect with folks. I know that starting out can be difficult, and there's no shortage of, like, things, resources out there for all of us to share. So yeah, I'm happy to share what I can. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Any sort of
This has
final
been so great.
Oh, I'm glad. Thank you guys so much for having such fantastic answers to like everyone's questions. Yeah, I'm always learning things, even if I am trans. It's not like I'm gonna go into everything and be like, oh, of course I know all of the answers to this. So it's been really great to like have other members of the community also speak on their experiences, and also share it with other people who are only familiar with sort of maybe what they see from people on social media who they follow, who may be genderqueer, and from me as one of the trans people at the RSJ. But yeah, any sort of final questions from anybody else?
That's been great.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again, I really appreciate it. Yeah, this meeting is recorded. I'm hoping to have like the recording uploaded sort of as like a video for the PRSSA website. So if you guys would like a link to that, I would be happy to provide one to you so that you have like documentation of the speaking that you've done here. It's been fantastic, really. I hope it's
so
been
much.
insightful for everyone else here too. But yeah, thank you. Thank you again. You guys are the best. I really mean that.
Aw, thanks so much for the invitation, honestly. This is like my first panel, so apologies for like amateur hour, but hey, I'm here, out here.
Yeah,
Thanks
you're
for
great.
holding space.
Yeah, like Kay recommended you guys to me and they were like, I can't make it, but this is a good group that you have. And like they were right. They were absolutely right. So yeah, I
Well,
will.
hopefully you get a chance to talk to Kay sometime too,
Yeah,
because Kay
Kay's
is a
great.
badass. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Kay's
absolutely.
amazing. But yeah, but absolutely. But thank you so much for giving your time and for all of you being here today.
Yeah.
You've come across from a different time zone. I really appreciate that. I believe you're 2 hours ahead of us, so it's approaching 9, so we will be ending here. But yeah, thank you. All the best.
Jesse,
Thank
love
you.
the largest group that we've had attend any of our meetings.
Oh, it is. You are correct. This is the largest group that we've had to attend for our programs. But yeah, I'm glad that people were able to show up for this. This is incredibly important, especially because it's PRSA is DEI month too. So incredibly important stuff coming forward. But yeah, thank you. Have a good one, everyone.
Thanks all.
Oh, here, I will be sure to, I'll send the emails in the PRSSA group chat. Bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Take care, you all.
Take care.